In the previous lesson, we looked at arrays and how we can store multiple values and multiple keys and values in a single variable. And they are a wonderful tool. And in fact, it would be hard to write some software without arrays. But one of the things we did in the previous lesson is we just picked and chose, different items and then chose to display those on the page. While yes, there may be times when we do that. It's going to be very rare, actually, whenever we know that we want the item at index 1 or we want the item at index 10. More often than not, whenever we have an array, we want to work with the array as a whole and work with every item within that array. And that's what a loop is very good at doing, because a loop gives us the ability to execute the same code over and over and over again. So if we want to work with every item within an array, and especially if we want to do the same thing with every item in the array, then the for each loop, and really any loop, is going to be what we want to use. But for right now, we're going to talk about the for each loop, because when it comes to working with arrays, this is the loop that we typically use. Now, we're going to do something a little different starting in this lesson, and that is we're going to start mixing our PHP and our HTML, because that is, after all, why we are using PHP, to change the output of our HTML. So if you look at the htdocs folder, there is a file called template.php. There is a folder called assets that has a subfolder called CSS, and then there's two CSS files here. These are going to be used for the template. So if you are following along and want to do exactly what I do on screen, you can take the contents of that template and then paste it into a new document, because that's exactly what we are going to do here. Now, there is one thing to note. We are going to display a title in these files, so that whenever you see them in the browser, you know that, okay, this is the page for the for each loop. But I'm trying to use the title variable, and it, of course, is not defined. So that's the first thing we need to do, is set the title. And we are working with the for each loop, so we're going to set title equal to that. Now, notice, though, that the syntax for outputting the title is a little different. We have been using echo, and we've also been using open angle bracket, question mark, PHP space echo, and then whatever we want to output. Well, now all we really have to do is this. This is a shorthand version of that. So we save a few keystrokes and really make our code a little bit easier to read and maintain in doing so. So you're going to be seeing this from now on, as opposed to just saying echo. Is just the easier thing to do. So now whenever we go to the browser, let's refresh, and now we see that this is the for each loop, and the title also says this is the for each loop. Okay, so we are going to be working with guitars. We want to display some guitars. So let's call this variable favorite guitars. This is going to be an array, and we'll have a Vela, we'll have the Explorer, and then we will have the Strat. So we want to display these in a list or a table, just some way so that we can see that these are my favorite guitars. Of course, I have more, but this is going to be manageable. So down here, I have an H1 element, and this is going to be my favorite guitars. And here where we see the content here, that's where we're going to put our content. Now, when it comes to mixing PHP and HTML, we want to limit the mixing as much as possible. I mean, we can't get away from mixing it completely because, well, there would be no way. There would be no way that we could output the title here without mixing PHP and HTML. However, we want to limit how much PHP we put in our HTML. And there are many different schools of thought as to how to do that. The more processing you do, more people will say that you need to separate your PHP and HTML. So if you had something like a loop, that might be something that you want to put up here at the top of the page so that that code will execute up here and it will be written up here so that you wouldn't have a for each loop inside of your HTML. However, in most cases and in most frameworks, if you're going to be outputting an array of things, chances are the for each loop is going to be here in the HTML. So that's what we are going to do here. So the for each loop is very easy to use. We start with for each, then we have a pair of parentheses, and then we have a pair of curly braces. So it looks a lot like an if statement, but we don't have a condition really. Instead, we specify the array that we want to work with. That was favorite guitars. And we want to also specify what we want to refer to each item within that array as. So we say for each item in favorite guitars as, and we're going to call each item a guitar. So we work with our array, and then we create a new variable for every item that we work with. So if we were going to output a table, let's do that. We'll say table, we'll say class equals table and table striped. And since each guitar is going to be on its own row, we are going to have to output a tr element and a td element. So we could do something like this. We will say tr and then td, and then we will have our guitar. We will close td, close tr, and there we go. So whenever we go to the browser and refresh, we are going to see our table. We have the heading, my favorite guitars, and then we have Vela, Explore, and Strat. So the code that is inside of the curly braces is what's going to execute for every guitar inside of favorite guitars. That's how the for each loop works. But there are some arrays where we have key value pairs. So let's call this KVP guitars, KVP being short for key value pairs. And we'll do kind of the same thing from the previous lesson. We'll have PRS, and then Vela. We'll have Gibson, and then Explore, and then we will have Fender for the Strat. And when it comes to the for each loop, this is going to be very, very similar. Let's do this. Well, we'll just copy this table. We'll paste it again. And we aren't working with favorite guitars. Instead, we're working with KVP guitars. And then we want to say that, okay, we have our guitar, but we also need the key for that guitar. But let's first of all see what this looks like in the browser. It's the same exact thing. So if you have an array that has key value pairs or an associative array, and you just specify a variable name, it's going to be the value. However, we could come in here and we could say key and then have arrow and then guitar for that variable. So the key is going to be our key and then the guitar is going to be the value. So that means that we have two variables to work with. So I'm going to add another column and we're going to output the key there. So now our original for each loop is still going to be the same, but our second has two columns. We have the key being listed here, then we have the value, and the same is true for the following rows. So the for each loop is pretty straightforward. For each item in an array, we want to execute certain code, and that's really it. So we're going to move on to the next loop, which is called a for loop. And the for loop is traditionally the first loop that you would normally learn. However, I'd like to start with the for each because it's just easier. The for loop is still easy once you get a grasp of what's going on, but it's not as straightforward as a for each. But when it comes to a for loop, you typically use just regular arrays, ones that have indexes, as opposed to associative arrays. So we're going to get rid of everything working with our second array so that we have just the first. And we also need to change the title. This is the for loop, not the for each. Now, the for loop is useful when you want to execute a loop for a certain amount of times. Like, let's say that we want to display the numbers 0 through 10. Well, with a for loop, we can do that very easily. The syntax, however, is a little different. The easy part is that we have for, a pair of parentheses, and then curly braces. And just like the for each loop, the code for our loop is going to be inside of the curly braces. However, it's what's inside of the parentheses is where things begin to be very different. Because since we want to execute a for loop just a certain amount of times, there are certain things that we need. Like, for example, we need to keep track of where we are as far as how many times we have executed the loop. So the first thing we need is a counter. And traditionally, we have a variable called I as our counter. So that's the first thing we need. We initialize our counter. I is equal to 0 because we typically start at the beginning of an array. Or it doesn't have to be an array. We just typically start at the very beginning, and that's 0. The second thing we need to know is how long we want to execute the loop. So this is a condition. We want to execute a loop for 10 times. So we say, as long as I is less than 10, we want to execute this for loop. But then we need to increment our counter, because every time our loop, it's called iterating. Every time our loop iterates, that's whenever our counter increases and the condition is met and we execute our code, that's incrementing through the loop. We need to keep track of how many times we have done that. So we need to change the value of I. We need to add 1 to it because that is keeping track of where we are. So we can say I equals I plus 1. That's going to take the value of I, add 1 to it, and then assign that to I. We could also write that like this. We can say I plus equals 1. That is the same thing. It's going to take I plus 1 and assign that back to I. But what I like to use is called the increment operator. It is simply I plus plus. Anytime you have plus plus at the end, it is going to increment that value. So if I is 0 and we say I plus plus, well, I is going to be 1 because it is incrementing I to whatever is the next number. So if I is 1 and we say I plus plus, then I becomes 2, and then 3, and then so on and so forth. So this is how this for loop executes. We initialize I as 0, and then it checks to see if I is less than 10. So right now, I is 0. 0 is less than 10. So the loop is going to execute. The code inside of it will execute. So this will execute. Then I is incremented, and then the condition is checked again. So now after the incrementation, I is 1. 1 is less than 10. So the loop executes. I increments to 2. 2 is less than 10. The loop executes. And it does this over and over again until we get to 10. So after 9, I becomes 10. 10 is less than 10? Well, no, it's not. So at that point, the loop exits and the code inside of the loop does not execute. So let's first of all do it like this. We will see 2 loops now in our for file. We'll have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. The loop ran for 10 times because we start at 0. And so that is how that works. But we want to work with our favorite guitars. So we need to know how many items are in our array. Now we could just hard code it 3 because we only have 3 guitars, but that's not very sustainable because if we add more guitars here, then we have to come down and change our loop. So instead we have a function called count. This is going to count how many items we have in our array. So we call count, we pass in our array, and that is going to give us how many items are in our array. So now we can do this. We can say guitar equals favorite guitars, and we can use the I variable as our index, and then we will simply output guitar. So now, whenever we view this in the browser, we're going to have 2 loops, Vela Explorer Strat, Vela Explorer Strat. So that second loop is our for each. We'll get rid of that, and now we just have our for loop. So it's a little bit different. Okay, it's a lot different. There's a lot to wrap your head around, but it is still useful. When you know how many times you want to execute a loop, the for loop is the loop that you want to use. However, in this particular case, the for each would work better because at this point in time, we're not really doing anything with I except using that as an index to get our value. Now, if we were doing something else with I, then it would make sense to use the for loop. And so now we'll move on to the final loop that we're going to talk about. Let's create a new file. It's called the while loop. And it's not really a combination of the two, but it is easier than the for loop, at least in my opinion. Let's change the title to while loop, not white, while, and then the syntax. So we have while, we have a pair of parentheses, and then the curly braces. That's it. Now, inside of the parentheses, we have our condition. So while our condition is true, the loop is going to execute. We are essentially going to do the same thing that the for loop did, but we're going to use the while loop to do it. I'm not going to say that the for loop is better for this case because some people might think that this is a little bit easier to follow, and I would agree with them in that sense. But we are going to start by initializing a counter variable, I is equal to 0, while I is less than the count of favorite guitars. We're going to echo our guitar. Now, the issue here, and the issue really with the for loop too, is if you don't increment I, you get a loop that never exits. So let's go to while, and we have vela, 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 vela. And you can see that it's still going. It will continue to fill out vela, 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 because we did not increment I here. So that is an issue. Anytime you're using a counter, be sure that you have an endpoint because you will get a loop that never ends. But this is essentially what the while loop does. It executes the code inside of our loop while the condition is true. Now, there's one other loop called a do while loop. And I have to admit, I've used a do while loop maybe 3 times in my entire career, and it's been almost 18 years since I've started my career. So that is a long time to go with just a few uses of do while. So we're not going to talk about it, at least right now.